Oh, well. Welcome everybody, and I see there's quite a few other people that'll be dripping in here. But welcome to our second, really I guess third, in a salon series exploring. Sort of what the web could look like in the broadest sense, and so we are so happy here at the Ostrom Workshop to again be joined both by Doc and Joyce Searles, as well as David Reed. I will not take any more time from them because we're all here to hear the ideas and engage with the speakers, but just a brief note to say thank you all for being here. And we have another one of these scheduled right after the new year. And so we'll share details with that before this is done. So thank you all. Handing over to you, Doc.
Okay, thanks a lot. Um, so at the last one of these, we had a really great, lively discussion at the end of it, and right in the middle of when I was answering a really good question, because the handoff didn't quite work right, we were cut off, and so. But there was also subsequent discussion, and about some of the very same topics. Some of them, like agency, for example, rose to the front, and we just said, "Hey, let's just have David back for a part two of this thing." So, a little bit more about David. I've known him for a long time, but the internet has known him longer. He's he is credited, I think, correctly as being one of the parents of the internet as we understand it. And I have a little image of it here. Back in, whoops, I jumped ahead of myself. Back in 2004, I asked the cartoonist Hugh McLeod to draw me an internet, and he gave me this. Uh, and it's illustrative in the sense that it's a world, but it's a world of nothing but ends. And that was David's idea, along with some colleagues of his, and it was expressed in a landmark paper called End-to-End Principles in System Design. I may have one word wrong on that, but in any case, end to end was the principle, and the internet basically operates on that. We're all ends. Um, what's in the middle is less important than all of the intelligence at the ends, and David can expand on that, and on some other things that have to do with that. So I'm going to relinquish the screen. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll pick up again when David's through with his talk and talk about the Byway. We have actually made some interesting progress on the Byway, which I'll go into, brought up by one of the students at the last event that we had at a tech hub here called the Mill, um, and so I'll expand on that, and hopefully that will exemplify some of what David's talking about. So I'll bring David on now. There you go, and you can take over. And I apologize for being invisible here, but I apparently am. Up, David, you're not audible for some reason, at least not to me.
Nope,
Uh,
you're still mute.
no, I don't see the mute symbol.
No, no sound, David.
We see your mouth moving, but we don't hear you.
Hmm.
Hmm. Uh, I don't. There's something's not right. The internet works fine. It's just Zoom doesn't. That's what's going on. Uh,
He's got an idea. He's going to try something else. He's going to try leaving and coming back.
yeah, that's generally the way it's done. Okay, he's back. I see him showing up in the participants. Nope, still not audible, David, for some reason. Is your mic fully plugged in or?
You sound
Wow.
like you sound like those guys on tech calls. Check your, is it
Yeah, I
plugged
know,
in the
I know. It's
wall?
like I feel very odd instructing David of all people on how to do this. He's probably way ahead of me or whatever. Yeah, maybe it'd work from your phone. Yes, that's a possibility to accept that um, you can't show your slides from the phone. So this is all about showing your slides. I could, let's see, bring up your slides because I have a copy of them.
Well, I don't,
If he could dial in, he could present his slides and talk at
Yeah,
the same time.
If you called in, I could bring up your slides and walk through those. That's a possibility.
well, if he dials in, he can actually show his slides from his phone too.
From the computer at the same time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. You'd think this internet thing would work. Got you.
Okay,
Mhm.
so you can see something here. Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see me, by the way, in
We
video?
can.
Yes, we do.
Oh, cool.
We now continue.
So there's something really weird going on, but okay. Now let's just see if I can share my screen.
It says that you are. Haven't
Hold
seen
on. I have to share my whole screen.
Can you pick the one thing, the one window on the screen?
I am in trouble making the area I'm sharing big, which I can fix. Okay, good. I can sort of fix. Oh dear. Hold on. Where's this guy? No. Oh, come on. Really? I am screen sharing. Do you guys see anything?
It says David Reed has started screen sharing, but it doesn't show us anything. No.
Does Zoom give you the little set of windows that are open? Did
I
you
have a
pick one?
green picture.
No.
It says I'm screen sharing, but I can't seem to tell it what part of the screen to share.
Boy.
Okay, Doc, I have a suggestion. I
Yeah.
just sent
You
the
put
slides.
up.
Yeah, I know. That's. Oh, wait a minute.
Can
Your
you
screen
put
is
them up?
shared. Your
Wait.
screen is shared.
I will stop sharing.
No, well, you had just successfully shared, by the way. It showed up. It
Oh,
actually
let
showed.
me try again.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Like 3 seconds before you, not even before you said to stop, it showed. There it is. Okay. Now you just.
So
have
you
to-
see it.
Yeah. Now you just. Now we have your whole screen, and if you could just find the
Find your slides.
slides.
Actually, you don't have my whole screen. You have a part of my screen.
I clearly it does look like a part.
Now I'm going to try. Hold on. This is all screwed up, but anyway.
Up, we're getting closer. I think.
So now what do you see?
I-
Not
It's-
slide.
It's not a slide. We see what look
You
like
see
some
anything that-
very tasteful fabric for some pants from.
Okay. Now do you see this?
No, I'm not sure what this is, but I'm not seeing it.
This is
I think let's either go to David's
Doc.
original suggestion or go forth without the slides. We can use our imagination.
Yeah, I think so. Doc, I'm going to ask you to share your screen
Okay,
with the
I'll do
slides
it.
I gave you.
Here we go.
Um,
Let me go into my mail, and in my mail, I will get what you sent.
So I'm going to start talking while you're doing it. Okay. So what Doc and I talked about as kind of an idea to start this off is to talk about my main point, which I got to last time, which is that the internet created a world of possibilities when we created it. I'm not going to go over the detailed history. Yeah, you can make that a slideshow. And so what I wanted to do is talk more about the space of possibilities, because what we have now, if you believe in technological determinism, what we have is the only possible result of creating the internet. But I don't agree with that. And in fact, we've kind of failed to take advantage of what the internet still is. And I'm specifically, when I talk about the internet, just to be clear, I'm not talking about all those things that have been built using the internet as an infrastructure. I'm specifically talking about the framework that largely is organized around what's called the IP layer of the internet. Because the IP layer is completely open, it's still there, and it's still possible to do all the things that we imagined were there. So it's kind of a mistake to think that, for example, the large e-commerce companies or the large social media companies have defined what the internet is. In fact, I reject that. I reject that fairly emphatically. So just go with me there. So what I talked about last time was that the goals of creating the internet and the technical decisions we made, and it's really important that these were technical decisions, not particularly political or social decisions. But the goals were around four main ideas. One is facilitating cooperation among arbitrary sets of computers, facilitating symbiosis at a social level, not just one man, one machine. And I hate using the word man, but I to try to use person or human is just awkward for me. So I'm going to use man with all its negative connotations, but please understand there's no gender association when I use it. So we want to facilitate symbiosis between collections of people and collections of machines as peers, essentially, or as cooperative sets of organisms, if you will. And to focus on coordination of cooperative action, not just data sharing. And cooperative action includes actions that involve many machines and many people, right? So that was part of the vision. And the final one is kind of about the infrastructure. The goal was to be as technologically independent as possible, as future-proof, both on technology and application as possible, and openly evolvable over time. So the idea is that the framework can evolve, hopefully by improving its capabilities rather than by narrowing them. So go to the next slide. So this comes back to the techno-determinism question. Does the design determine social structure, or does social structure determine the internet design, or, as I would tend to say, is neither or both true? So first of all, the question is, like, who actually decides what social structure is? You know, these are kind of more political points, but they're also technical points. You know, who should decide? Do we have to decide? Must we agree? Essentially, the decision we made was, let's assume no one decides and no one has to decide, and we don't all have to agree. So in that sense, I'll say it's kind of an open, free architecture. But as we were sort of considering this, you know, are there options or alternatives as we go forward? And the answer is, obviously, there are large numbers of options and alternatives for how you use the internet. And can multiple structures coexist? That is, like, if one takes place, like the Google, you know, the FAANG collection of activities, or smartphones as defined by the cellular companies, do they essentially rule out the existence of other structures? And the final set of questions comes down to the issue that really concerns me. It's concerned me since about 1975, as I thought about the internet as it evolved, which is, how does social control arise? And this is kind of, it sounds like a strange jump, but remember back in 1975, 1976, we were starting, at least those of us who were using networks and considering the internet, we were starting to be very interested in what happens when we have a global network of networks, technology everywhere, personal computers. We had the concept of a Dynabook back then and so forth. And we were concerned about the same sort of question that folks were concerned about in, say, the 1850s in the French Revolution, post-French Revolution era, which is how does social control arise, and how, and can we grab control of it? Because they were certainly under a great deal of social control and were rebelling against it. So we actually I considered, and many others who were thinking about that kind of future considered, where does the control in this collective human-machine symbiosis arise from, and is it really necessary? Now, the decision that, politicians have made over time has generally been hierarchical control. If hierarchical control arises, it's assumed to be the best and optimal normal form. But there are also those who talk about creating bottom-up cooperative agreements. Certainly the early anarchists did. And there's a final choice which occurs to me as a technologist and didn't seem to occur so much to other people, which is that maybe some controls are necessary, but you only need the controls that you actually need to function as a collective, to carry out collective action. So the internet actually tended toward that last. We basically said, if you don't need control, don't include mechanisms for it. That was part of the end-to-end argument, or arguments that took place. Okay, so we're basically building a framework based on the idea that it would be possible to construct a structure involving humans and machines that was minimally globally controlled, where we didn't know what the minimal thing is. So we came up with a bunch of ground rules for creating a network of networks, which was kind of the name of our dream. One was that networks could be composed together in a very simple way, basically by connecting them and agreeing and voluntarily agreeing to carry each other's packets. So if one network is a faster way to get a packet to the ultimate destination, then that network, as part of joining, was volunteering to combine with the others that were involved. Second, the only basic rule at the IP layer was cooperative at least once delivery of every message. And even that was weakened. It's sort of called best efforts. And it's defined by distributed routing agreements among the voluntary network participants. Now, this is interesting because most people don't understand that the internet today is still voluntary, still a voluntary carriage. It's still cooperative at the physical layer. Anyone can disconnect any network at any time if they own that subnetwork. But their incentives are never to do so, essentially, although we see governments now trying to get together and create disconnection. And what made this work in the ground rules was a standardized address space, independent of the physics, defined by the cooperative agreement, and a standardized message with arbitrary content and the idea was that no peeking would be required to make the system work. So no peeking at the content. And in fact, we wanted to disallow peeking at the content of messages. That was the era when there was a battle, what were called the crypto wars, which continued. And the idea that you could achieve that no peeking by end-to-end encryption was debated both technically and by the military folks who controlled encryption at the time. But we decided to leave open the question and basically say no peeking allowed, and we'd like to enforce that. Finally, no content interpretation would happen during the transported messages. Just to keep things simple, the network basically did one very simple thing, which was deliver messages. And in order to do that, we decided that the message meaning had to be defined only by the sender and ultimate recipient. They could speak arbitrary languages. They could speak arbitrary protocols between them. The network had no business knowing what those protocols were, but obviously we created an entity along with the internet called the IETF, where folks who wanted to define protocols and say how to interpret them could in fact issue an RFC and say this is a protocol and this is how its messages should be interpreted. But again, there's no rule that says you have to use those protocols. You can use any protocol you like. There's just, like with any language, if no one else speaks your language, it's kind of, a pointless exercise. So these kind of were the key ground rules. They still are the key ground rules, although there's attempts to try to argue that they're bad design or something. But from the point of view of the earlier goals, they really derive directly from those goals. So most of the discussion of networks by most lay people kind of don't ever see this stuff. They see the results of this design. So the goal, this resulted in something that I think was pretty remarkable, which is the flexibility to assemble structures and patterns of communication that we'd never seen before. In the telephone network, the pattern of communication is you make a phone call and you talk for a while and then you stop making a phone call. There were other communications mechanisms like broadcast TV that had very different patterns of communication. Somebody showed up at a studio and, the contents that they uttered in the studio was sent one way to everybody. And maybe you could add, call-in shows by calling back on a telephone, but that was all specialized to a particular application. So the new idea that I observed and many other people started to get is that this kind of architecture actually supports group forming. That is, creating a group of cooperating entities, sharing information and goals and actions with that group, modifying the group and dissolving the group without asking for permission, without incorporating the group, without any, just very easily. A reply all list in email, for example, is a group, and it's easily supported in the internet. Second thing is that universality of the base addresses, those IP addresses, is guaranteed. That is, what I mean by universality is that anybody can use an address and be assured that, in sending a packet, and they can be assured that somehow the packet will get to the place that is defined by that universal address. And then sort of finally, the other new idea is that you can decentralize the construction and activities of groups, because there are a variety of protocols that a set of people or a set of machines or mixed people and machines can adopt. And many of them are actually, standardized in RFCs for forming groups and keeping track of groups and dissolving groups and so forth. So this, and those groups can have arbitrary structures. So the flexibility to assemble is kind of a novel thing that the internet created that wasn't available really in machine form. And so why did we care about assembling structures? Or how, basically, why did it work? Well, there's no session notion maintained in the network. The network doesn't keep track of who's talking to who at all. And it doesn't have a notion of a session. We invent sessions sometimes for mnemonic reasons. But in fact, the internet doesn't know about it. And also authentication, that is knowing who is participating, is left to the users themselves. Again, we know how to do this, for example, cryptographically, identifying who somebody is. But a really key idea that has evolved is that you can actually build very complicated structures without having accounts. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit more, but when I was talking to Doc the other day, this notion of account basically is a destroyer of personal agency. Because if I, for example, want to interact with Google, or with Facebook, or with just, some e-commerce company, quite often I get asked to create an account. Now, who holds that account? Who defines who I am in that account? Well, the entity itself. So it creates an immediate asymmetry. There's, I am not the same person to Google and to Facebook, for example, because I have two different accounts there. At the network level, accounts create even more control, more asymmetry, because the account keeper is the network itself. So, this idea that there's no authentication in the network, there's no universal authentication, and therefore no accounts, is something that allows you to construct structures that otherwise would not exist. And for example, it allows you to create cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrencies are like bearer bonds. You don't create a currency by having a broker or having, a particular government and being a citizen or whatever. There's no accounts. You just hold the cryptocurrency. Shared database protocols are capable of being decentralized. So we've learned over lots of years in computer science to build very effective shared databases that don't have an owner. A great example of that, a trivial example of that, is blockchain. There's no owner of the blockchain, yet there's a directory of participants built into the blockchain. So taking an economic diversion here, I spent a lot of time looking at group formation in the economic sphere. I even published a Harvard Business Review note about it, describing it. It got called Reed's Law. But the key point is, in economics, options have value. That is, that relates to the word flexibility. The question is, why would you build a switching architecture? Why is that better than a lot of direct connections? Well, the reason for flexibility in a switching architecture is that options have value. You want to be able to connect to one guy one day, one guy another day. And if you have options to create groups and maintain them and so forth, you create even more option value, which basically is the value of flexibility in a theoretical economic sense. And you can destroy option value very easily by using techniques, for example, such as the one called enclosure by those who study Ostrom's work. And then finally, there is a political diversion around this ability to assemble structures, which I will just mention. Again, the internet wasn't designed for political reasons, but it does have political implications. The idea of freedom of assembly, which is usually considered minor compared to freedom of speech, by folks who worry about the First Amendment, for example. Freedom of assembly is a very powerful political mechanism, and by limiting freedom of assembly, even if you maintain freedom of speech, you can control a population. So again, it's a useful political diversion. So let's go on to the next slide. So these are sort of ground rules.
Did I overshoot it? Oh, sorry.
Going backwards.
I'm sorry, I hit the wrong one. There we go. Sorry.
Okay. So I just wanted to mention briefly, this is not a full enumeration, but there are a bunch of what I would call anti-internet ideas. And these are popular ideas. It's kind of like, left versus right, except that I don't think there's anything left-wing about the internet or right-wing about the anti-internet ideas or vice versa. But things that actually destroy the value of the internet, the sort of stuff I talked about early, include such things as governance. The whole point of the internet was not to require governance. It was certainly not to require sovereignty. Yet many humans think that there is no possible functioning society without governance. So this causes a great deal of political controversy about the internet because it doesn't seem to need it, and lots of people want to be the governor. The second anti-internet idea that we see all the time is the idea that the transport layer, that is those who provide access to the internet and carry the messages, ought to do some kind of message content inspection for any of a variety of reasons. And usually this is argued on the basis of necessity. That is, how would the network work if all the messages couldn't be inspected? There was a big debate a few years ago called the reasonable network management, and it centered entirely around whether the network providers, in particular folks like Comcast or whatever, should be allowed to inspect the content of messages in order to manage the network better. I spent a lot of time arguing that was not necessary by design, and I still believe that's true. It shouldn't be necessary. Second was the idea of tariffs imposed by the transport based on whatever content is in the messages. Assuming you inspect the content, maybe you should charge more for messages that have more value to some endpoint, whether it's a message that is part of sending a streaming video or a message that's signing a $1 billion contract. Maybe the network should get a big share of the value of that. Another one that continually arises is attempts to prevent voluntary connectivity among the networks. We're seeing that a lot by governments today. China is partially disconnected from the internet at almost all times, and it also does message content inspection. The Soviet Union has recently tried to demonstrate to itself that it can disconnect the entire Soviet network without all of its internal capabilities failing. And again, this is essentially an anti-internet idea, and it does need to cause concern, although usually you can route around these barriers.
Oops, I hit. No, that was at my end, I think. Screen sharing.
Yep. Anyway.
Oh, so that's the end of the show. I didn't know that. Okay, sorry, I hit.
Yeah, you went to the next slide.
Hang on a second. Let me.
Be careful about that.
I can go back. Okay.
Very last slide.
Yeah.
The last three are things that I've implicitly mentioned. One is trying to put additional functions into the transport function. Often this is proposed by people who say, oh, it would be a whole lot easier since nearly everybody needs, for example, to encrypt traffic. Why not encrypt it, as a function of the network and let the network take care of doing the encryption so that the endpoints don't have to encrypt it. They just present their messages in the clear. That clearly makes the transport layer, which may not be the user, able to observe all the content, which is against the whole design. Similarly, introduction of accounts, especially accounts for just using the transport, or using transport to get to particular destinations, is an anti-internet idea. And finally, creating property rights or sovereign rights based on where messages are being sent, that, and a property right defines who an owner is. So the owner is, or the sovereign over that communication, gets that right. If it gets that right purely based on where the message is sent, that again is anti-internet. Now, you could do any or all of these things. The internet design does not prevent these anti-internet ideas. But essentially, my point is, if you start introducing these ideas, you're on a very steep, slippery slope to basically creating something that is not got any of the properties of the internet. The reason is because they contradict the whole design goal of the internet. So why I decided to talk about this time is just to raise the point that the internet is a very special construction. It's on the one hand very simple, but in its simplicity and what it leaves out and what it basically says you probably shouldn't do, it creates a very open, flexible mechanism for creating structures. And so, for example, the Byway isn't like the entire future of the internet, but we ought to be able to build something like the Byway on top of the internet and allow it to demonstrate its value to society, independent of whatever Google does or Facebook does or Amazon does. And that's really why I'm very concerned personally, and I think we all should be very concerned, that the idea of what got built up to today is the end of the game for networking. In fact, I think it's a sidetrack. And in fact, it's the ultimately maybe it's the Byway on the way to better exploitation of a universal communication structure like the internet. And we haven't ruled, so far we haven't modified the internet so you can't create things like the Byway. So that's my, and the key thing about the Byway, I think, is that it exploits certain key ideas here that the internet enables that have not been utilized as very well before. One is the lack of accounts, or if you do it right, it would be the lack of accounts. One is the idea of symmetry between endpoints. Anyone can participate, any group can form, independent of some owner or government or whatever. So with that, I'm kind of done, and hope I didn't all the time. But I think we have a bunch of time to discuss.
Yeah, we have, we have 18 minutes until the top of the hour. Let me pop out of this. I'd like to go, there's been a lot of action in the back chat. I want to ask Isak, though, quickly, because I think he's the host right now. Can we go past the hour? If we can't, we'll just pack in as much as we can.
I think let's, like as always, I think some people have things right at 4 or whatever,
Yeah.
Zoom world back to back. But if you need to stay on the channel, I think at least this time when Angie leaves, it won't all shut down. So
Okay. All right. Well,
yeah, so
that's good.
try to
I
get
don't
to
want
a
to. I don't want to
stopping
put
place
that
when
on Angie's. It just it happens. Things happen. Okay, I'm gonna go to. Oh, let me pop out of this and go to my pile of slides, um, which okay, here we go. Okay, this one. All right, there's that. Share. Okay, I'm not seeing the very one that I want to do. It shows my desktop.
You're not yet sharing the screen.
Oh, maybe that'll do it. Okay. No, I am. Okay. Well, if I hit share the screen, I'm going to share my whole desktop. I don't want to share the whole desktop. I can share David's. Okay. Okay, I'm going to click on this and I'm going to try going back to Zoom again, hitting share screen again.
Is your desktop not a commons doc?
Yeah, not yet. It's the okay, now I got it.
I'm
There
sure
it
it's
is.
uncommon.
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, okay, so um so the Byway, so those who don't know, the Byway is a project that Customer Commons came up with. Joyce and I are on the board of Customer Commons. We worked, and we've, I'm leaving out a whole bunch of slides here because I want to move fairly quickly um, toward to what we're doing. Anyway, it's I'll explain what the Byway is. I mean, we're going to work on it. So here's roughly how we do conversation in the physical world. It's a half duplex, take turns kind of thing. That's supposed to be the physical world in the middle. One person speaks, person A speaks, person B listens, person B speaks, and person A listens. We can interrupt each other. We can talk over each other. We can gesture to each other. But basically, it's kind of messaging like. I mean, it's we take turns, and in this world, in the internet world, there are lots of ways of doing this, but the way that is most familiar to us and really works best and has since the 80s is plain old email. Email is what in the open source world we started calling NEA, which means nobody owns it, everybody could use it, and anyone can improve it. Uh, our email at searles.com, Joyce and I are at searles.com, ran in a box under a desk in one of our houses and has operated in other places like that. It's been in a rack somewhere. It's right now in a cloud, but I can move that cloud from one place to another. But the key thing is it's something that came out of the environment that David just described. It is all the things that are internet and none of the things that are anti-internet. Whereas these things are anti-internet in some ways. They're not really because they are services sitting on top of the internet. We could do conversation with these as well. These are chat systems or messaging systems. Even SMS, you got to have a phone company to do SMS. That's the one in the lower right. Facebook Messenger is they're Apple's messaging. Some of these can carry what some of the others do, and you can federate them in some ways. But basically, they are not this. This is better, and that's a better model than this. So, and that's basically messaging as a service. As a service is a big Web 2.0 idea. We talked last time about how the web. We tend to think inside of the web. There's infrastructure as a service. There's software as a service. SaaS. It's a gigantic business. This is messaging as a service, and there it is. So the Byway isn't that. The Byway is a marketplace for everyone and everything. It is basically what we call the street in the vernacular of the world. What's the word on the street? Kind of way of looking at it. The Byway is that. It is not. Nobody owns this. Nobody owns it. It's nobody owns it. Everybody can use it. And anybody can improve it. And it isn't built yet, but we're going to do it. On the Byway, here's the key thing on the sell and buy part of the Byway. You can do other things, but if you're buying and selling, but on the Byways, buyers say what they are looking for, and sellers hear only what buyers are interested in the sense that buyers publish what their interests are to the world, but sellers only hear what they're interested in. So if this is a flower seller, if they're selling chrysanthemums, they only hear chrysanthemum. They only hear demand. They don't hear anything other than demand. So, where do we start? We talked about this last time in our last gathering, and we talked about a number of areas: food, cars and parts, collectibles, the gig economy. But this is a student came forward with this one. How about students themselves? And if you look here, Indiana University, this is from their from IU's own website for admissions. 40 some thousand people come and go at the end of every semester and the start of the next. They're unloading piles and piles and piles of stuff. I should point out that Joyce and I completely furnished our condo here for under $500. Basically, with stuff people are selling, not just students. So we actually got one table somebody left on the street. But there's an opportunity for a market here, and we want to go forward with this. This is our use case. We want to do this use case, and we want to have people saying what they're looking for, and people hearing what they're only what they're looking for, saying what they've got to sell or what they want to buy. So how does that work on the Bloomington Byway? The Bloomington Byway, because we're going to do it here. Okay, here's a student. She's running what we've talked about so far is an app, but David really came up with a better way of putting it. This is her agent. And this should resonate with Adrian Gropper, who is on this call. He's been calling for agents for a long time. And I think what David said about the agent is your account. Okay, you don't need an account on the other side because you've got an agent here. Okay, and she's saying, I want an inkjet printer. And that message goes out like RSS does, basically, but only to, only it goes to the world, as it were, and there'll be mechanisms for that we can talk about in a minute. And it comes to the one-off return address. It obscures who she is. It's kind of a burner, you might say. But there's a mechanism for a response to get back to her. It's a call and response, but it's pub sub. Goes there, and over here is another student, and she's got her agent, and it's listening. That's an app, as it were. It's listening for a bunch of stuff that, she has to sell. She's got a desk, a bed, she's got a fryer, she's got a couch, a table, a rug, and pillows. But she's hearing inkjet printer. Okay, so she says, I've got an Epson WF 3520 with a lot of extra ink, which, by the way, we have here. Just one reason I mentioned it. It's one I got at Goodwill. And she sends a message back that actually goes by plain old-fashioned email, and it gets back to the student. And then correspondence can carry on from there. But basically, the mechanism we're talking about here is just this. It's a pub sub system that doesn't require a platform in the middle, doesn't require something centralized in the middle. It is any end to any other end. We've to some degree prototyped this. Hadrian Zbarsha, who thought this up when he came to us, he said, because he was on the Apache Foundation for a long time, likes Apache's ActiveMQ because it's highly used inside organizations, especially big enterprises, using URNs. URNs are a way to address things. And the key thing here is that these are addresses, they're not identities. In other words, you don't need, student A on the left doesn't need an account with student B on the right. All she needs is an address. And if she's got an agent that can address to the world something that says, I want an inkjet printer, then that's the way to go. So what are the work areas that we have on this? We have to develop it. We have some code from Hadrian. But it's not enough yet. We need research, and we've talked about research already. I think by confining this and going after students, I think we can narrow that down a lot. We're going to have governance in it. Governance is going to have to be involved. How can this be abused? How shouldn't it be abused? If a commons develops here, this happens at IU. We want IU to be involved. They're going to have thoughts about this. I suppose, but we could do it in the wild as well. But once things get civilized, you're going to need governance. Um, Participation. How do we recruit participants? We'll need some funding, or we'd like to have some funding. It's imaginable doing it without it. We'd rather not. And publicity. Those are some basic work areas that we've got. And I'd like to see us, hey, let's aim towards something. Let's put a stake in the calendar. Let's do it from May to August is basically the great turnover time. Joyce and I moved here during that time frame, and we picked it on purpose. So that's what we'd like to be able to do. So, and these are upcoming salons. So, and I just want to promote them a little bit. Robin Chase invented Zipcar. Some of you are familiar with Zipcar, now owned by Avis, but basically, she thought up basically a kind of end-to-end way of doing car rentals. Ethan Zuckerman is a former colleague of mine at the Berkman Klein Center. He's now at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and his whole focus is what's going on in the internet next. He's got a wonderful podcast as well. And closing this series is Shoshana Zuboff on the right. She coined the term surveillance capitalism, had a bestseller with The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is basically running the conversation about that. So she's coming up in April. So that's that. And this is how to get in touch with us. And I'll back off of those. And we've got 7 minutes until the top of the hour. We had some questions in the chat.
Actually, Doc, can I just have to point out that there's an overall question I have about the Byway?
Sure, go for it.
So I think it would be really interesting because, for example, you propose that there may be a need for governance. I think that's an assumption that may not be true in the long run. And you propose a couple of other things. And I think part of the research ought to try to test those. It kind of fits into the Ostrom Center's general rejection of sort of received wisdom about how systems ought to be organized or need to be organized. And so, for example, you proposed a matching system, which is
right. And I meant to call it that. I had a note on it, and that's your point, David.
That's okay.
You pointed out that this is a matching system. That's what this is. Thanks.
Right. And there's no particular reason. Most people think a matching system requires some kind of central coordinator, the matcher. But in fact, we know how to build completely decentralized matching algorithms. And one of the advantages of completely decentralized matching algorithms is that there's no central system that can play favorites. You know, the classic example of the guy who says, calls up the telephone exchange and says, I need a funeral home. And it turns out the operator is the spouse of the one of the funeral home directors. So they always direct such inquiries to one thing, one entity. And that's how the Scroger switch got invented to get operators out of the middle. I think some of these questions of how you do matching are more fundamental than you might think. Admittedly, you could get away without a matching agent, but a philosophy that's similar to the way we designed the internet might be to say, well, we can implement the matching agent in a single computer, but let's make sure we don't define it as being implemented in a single computer. Let's define it as what it needs to be. So it's those kind of bigger questions that I find particularly, useful to explore here, because you could clearly create a campus sharing thing like Craigslist. And Craigslist is fine, but why does it have to be architected like Craigslist?
Right.
Real good question.
Really, the thing that distinguishes the Byway, I think, from things like Craigslist and eBay and whatever, of course, is the platform, and that there's no third party making this matching. It really happens in basically in the wild and at the agency of the principals, the buyers and the sellers, or whatever the two interested sides are. And that's when we first thought of it, we thought of it very much like my platform is my computer, my node. I am a mini platform of my own. It doesn't have to be only mine. It could be in a community that I care about, because maybe initially I wouldn't know how to do that, but I could certainly go to a community that is around interests that I care about. Maybe it's my fraternity or my sorority, and we're going to organize this like a rummage sale, or, there's lots of ways that we could do this appropriate to your talk, David, when you talked about the fact that, we can form groups, and the groups can have their own priorities and their own ideas about what's valuable. So I think that the Byway is it's like the internet. It just provides the way that social things can happen together or separately, but with autonomy, without third parties taking over.
I actually, I'd love to hear from either Angie or Isak on what they might think about the governance that might happen here, because in a way, I mean, I see the governance as emergent, not top down, but in out. From what groups form here, and what commons form, and how do they self-govern, whatever that happens to be, is very much not about top down. So do either of you guys want to say something about that?
I'm sure Angie will have much more to say about this, but I would actually like to say, similar to what Adrian said, I think that it's also not trivial to address the asymmetries that currently exist within the players, right? And that's sort of what we're trying to address with the system to begin with. But I think that, perhaps there's a need for some type of governance mechanism, right, to to deal with that existing asymmetry, right, or to stop that from happening again, right? Because there's nothing really from keeping a major actor from accumulating capital within a sort of exchange system like this.
I'll also throw in that if you try to do this, from a student perspective, and say, my house, my sorority, my whatever, there's massive turnover. So you still need someone who's going to every year say, hey, didn't we do this last year? Where is that? Where did it go? Where, how would we do it again this year? And that's governance, right? Having someone who does nothing more than create a system of access is governance. So, it's worried me for a while that we talk about student communities, because they're really hard to keep, the progression as they graduate. And so, I'll throw that out there as well, is that, when you're talking about this particular type of marketplace, you'll have to figure some continuity, and that creates authority, access, and demands some levels of governance, in my opinion.
That makes sense. I also think of it from the business point of view, is that, the students, they come and they go, but maybe there's a business that that helps them facilitate this, that isn't a platform, but just helps them do the transition, and that, that can be paid for in a much lighter weight way than, okay, we're going to be running this platform where, all the furniture comes, where everybody, just trades on the platform. Trying to do it from the real autonomy of the individual and the privacy, because, it happens without anybody knowing what's happening until they go off, not identifying who the parties are until it's time to actually make a transaction. So.
I think, but just moving off governance for a second, I mean, one of the I don't know why it didn't occur to us in the first place that this particular use case is incredibly helpful and useful and has a lot of potential to it. But there is just a huge inefficiency involved in that right now, the way it tends to work. And what we're talking about here is like, how do we make markets work online? If you think of natural markets, in, in, crossroads and agoras, how did those work? And how do you take the best of those and make it work on the internet, on this end-to-end thing? And the natural thing, the industrial
Doc,
age.
Doc,
Yeah,
Doc,
go ahead.
just let me comment briefly. To be honest, I am a lifelong anarchist, and that gives me a different perspective on this. And I, particularly, if you look at some of the work maybe of David Graeber in his newest book, there's a lot of people that say efficiency is a lot of economists who praise efficiency. And efficiency is a term that has no real meaning, but is often used to argue, for example, for centralized command and control structures because they seem to be, quote unquote, more efficient. And I would be suspicious of just saying, oh, yes, this is more efficient, so it's better, because the real question is not whether it is efficient. The real question is whether it serves the interests of the participants.
So I should be clear. What I was getting ready to do is contrast what I see what I was doing here is experimental, of course, and we'll see how it goes.
Right.
But what I meant was that the typical thing that we do, and to your point about efficiency, is a well taken one. And Phil just made a point in the chat that decentralized systems are never efficient, and I was going toward that. I was going toward what are the other paths we can explore that are more like what we see in the natural world and less like what we get in the industrialized one, where our first impulse is to do what seems to be the most efficient, which is I'll put a really big thing in the middle of this and run it all. Right. That's what we tend to do. That's the model that we've had for 150 years, and maybe we could do something that's more anarchic in the best sense of the word. I'm kind of an anarchist too. I'm not sure what kind of an ist I am, but more that than some other things. And we're not even so okay. Doug Carmichael's hand is up, and I'm sorry, Doug, that we missed this earlier. You're still on mute, as you see. find
That's
the button.
fine. Okay. I find myself wondering whether the marketization of everything is the financialization of everything, and maybe we don't want to go there. On the efficiency point, what's efficient in a market transaction might not be efficient in making good people. There are lots of things to be efficient around that are not all working together.
Okay, first, I think we use market to mean a lot of different things, and I think the free market libertarians mean the market to be like the great royal of all of business, in which the best or the most efficient rise to the top and run everything. And when I think about it, just speaking personally, my model is, people selling stuff to other people in a public place, and not something more complicated than that. I think that there's the social model of that is not a bad one. Eric Rangel puts in, I love these natural models. So, I mean, one of our tasks here, or one of mine anyway, for myself, is to try and look at what's possible without the prejudices we've acquired over the last 150 years of the industrial age and the norms that are there. One of the reasons that, and this is part of the side conversation we've had in the chat, of the two horseshoes of the two agents on either side, is they're the same size, they're attracted to each other, they kind of point to each other, they're kind of like magnets. It's actually a concept that we developed at Project VRM out of the Berkman Center at Harvard, which is still going on, and Adrian's involved in, a number of other people on this call are involved in, way back at like '06 or '07, that ideally we have any two parties connecting with each other and operating productively rather than exploitively. How do you do that? And it's, that's kind of we're trying to be as tabula rasa about this as we can, while respecting the fact that there's an awful lot written on the tabula already. I hope that's an answer. I don't know if it is or not, but I'm trying.
Adrian has his hand up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay. There he is.
So what I loved about David's presentation around the internet is that it focused on society and the benefits to society, at least as I heard it, instead of the individual. Whereas the presentation you made of the Byway and a lot of failing privacy or lack of privacy law in this country that gets into the issues of privatization and profit that we were just talking about in the last couple of minutes, focus on harms to the individuals or benefits to the individuals. And I honestly don't see what David is proposing in the design of a messaging-based foundation for whatever we do next. Thank you.
There's just speaking quickly on this, there's always seems to be this argument that goes, not so much an argument, but sort of like a set of magnets in conversation, which one side says it's the collective, it's social, and the other side says no, it's personal, it's the individual. And I think it's always both. I think we have first person plural and second and third person plural and singular pronouns for a reason. We are we, and we are I, and we are us, and my, and the rest of it. And we have to draw a circle around all of them somehow.
I'm trying to decide which David you were talking to, Adrian, but since Doc is also David.
So many of us.
But I just want to make it clear, I'm not proposing a solution to the Byway problem, but I sort of, and I don't think the Byway problem is the only issue that the internet bears on. I'm very much interested in the research opportunity that the Byway, hands-on research, that is research on real social people, to see if we can develop structures that work better. As one of the points of being a lifelong anarchist, for example, is that no anarchist has a solution that they're proposing. Right? Anarchists basically are critics of solutions, and they try to be constructive critics quite often. But I think your distinction between social and individual benefit is something that really needs to be questioned occasionally. And in the case of the street, what is the social benefit? How would you define that? And what is the individual benefit? What are the costs? Rather than just assuming that everybody knows what they are, because I'm not sure they do.
And it seems to me that we've moved very, very far to big entities having much of the control, and that the side of individuals hasn't had much control. And I'm not talking about just individuals, but individual groups like, families and people that, communities, people that work together. It's why should all the big corporate commercial entities have all the tools and have all the ways to play? I think we should have some on the side of individuals and their groups. I don't think it's an either or, it's like, that's why we called it the Byway, because there is the highway. The highway exists, but I really wouldn't want us to walk on it. So I'm gonna try walking on the byway. It seems like it's a little more human scale. So I think we're probably at the end.
Other questions or thoughts? I don't see all hands that are raised. Adrian's hand is still up.
Yeah, well,
And,
that hasn't come down.
No, it did come down. I was just going to answer David's point, which I put in the chat anyway, which is about the law of agency predates networks and the internet by hundreds of years, and it's foundational.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I believe it's derived from Greek, which is agera, which means to do. But I'll have to check on that.
Well,
So,
if we are winding up, then just a reminder to everyone, you know, this is, I know we're about to get into Thanksgiving and everything, but you know, the goal of these conversations is to spark a plug that we can, you know, continue to engage with these and you know, incorporate these ideas into, you know, the sort of experiments that we're doing here. Keep in mind that we have another one February 7th, is that right? Is the next date. So
right.
hope that you will all join us then. Thank you once again, David, David Reed, for being with us. And thank you all for staying a little bit extra, being generous with your
Yeah.
time.
I want to say as well, I think these salons, they don't need to be our only opportunities to meet. I think
Exactly.
that they're I mean, I want to follow up with Josh. I want to follow up with a number. Anybody else who wants to help with this, you know, put their shoulders to a wheel, write code, come up with research topics, research foci, whatever it takes. Very interested in. I mean, we're recruiting participation here.
Yes.
So there we go.
Thank you.